Hello, ladies and gents. This is Mr. Williams here with a presentation on Chapter 6 of the Pigman. And just like Chapter 5 was on the families of Mr. Pignotti, this is Part 2 of that presentation, as we're starting to learn more about these characters that are in John and Lorraine's lives. Now, you may have already figured this out, but we're not supposed to really like these family units that John and Lorraine have. With the Conlins, we met the mother, we'll meet the father later, and we meet Miss Jensen in Chapter 6, and she's just not a pleasant individual. We already are predisposed not liking her because she criticizes Lorraine regularly, and she's one of our protagonists. That's Lorraine, that is. And Mrs. Jensen just doesn't do a good job making us feel like we should be supporting her in any way. First off, let's get the basics for this family. There is no Mr. Jensen in this story. He's not part of the family. There was a divorce followed by a death. We don't have a ton of information about either of these items, but we do know that he's not in the picture. We should also note that the mother works long shifts as a private nurse, 4 to 12 hours, helping the elderly, those that are terminally ill, and we don't get to see her often, but we know that's where the medical interest and medical knowledge may come from for Lorraine. Now, the thing that's interesting here is, especially with Lorraine being very compassionate, especially in that scene where she goes to the teacher's house and sees the elderly mother in the living room, the mother doesn't really have compassion for these patients. She talks about them very coldly. She doesn't really care about what's going on with them, and she's really more proud of the fact that she's right about the character dying than anything else. And with that being said, the Undertaker scene is very disturbing, talking about getting money under the table for referring one person or a family member to the Undertaker. Just really something that's disturbing to think of. You want to think of these private nurses that are helping people out that are elderly and in a dangerous situation to be very caring individuals, and Miss Jensen is not that. She even steals from the deceased patient, and that's something that she does to kind of even out her pay, but still it's irreprehensible. Now, other notes about Miss Jensen: doesn't want Lorraine to hang out with boys. We'll talk more about that later. And just to note this, that she's worried about appearances not as much as Mrs. Conlin is, but more about how money and looking poor, no one's going to badmouth her family. So I guess that's a positive scenario, but it also means that there's some concerns and worries that Miss Jensen has, and she's always kind of forcing Lorraine to make choices that will help the house be clean or that'll make the family look better, even if it's against Lorraine's best interest. Now, this brings a new characterization of Lorraine, because first of all, we see Lorraine lying a lot to her family. We know that John lies a lot, and Lorraine has lied too in the past, but the lies she tells her mother are very, let's say, deceiving and devious, so it's almost as sneaky as John can be. She decides to stay home for the zoo. Initially, Lorraine didn't want to do this, and the mother wants her to stay home to clean the house, but she stays home to go to the zoo with Mr. Pignotti, not because the mother asks her to. Now, speaking of that zoo trip, let's look at what happens during the zoo trip, because that's going to be an important scene for the novel as a whole. We'll come back to this later on. It's an important trip to talk about, especially in the long run, since it's the first time we really see the three characters interacting. First of all, we have to talk about how Lorraine has confidence for the first time here. She's wearing those Ben Franklin glasses that are meant to be ridiculous, and she states that John would do this all the time. And part of this is that John and Lorraine are so close that part of that leadership, that cockiness that John has, maybe he's rubbing off on Lorraine. She's willing to stand up because of John, and that's a good sign. Now, Lorraine is still a paranoid individual. She's going to be concerned about omens, so when she's at the zoo and she sees the rude attendant that's giving out food, the angry bird attacking her, the boy outside the reptile house, or the child outside the reptile house, we have to ask ourselves if these are actually omens because of the insecurity around Lorraine and that she sees these kind of omens everywhere. Now, in this scene, we also get to meet Bobo, Mr. Pignotti's best friend, but he doesn't turn out to be what we expect. It turns out to be that creature on the right, a baboon. Now, this event connects to Mr. Pignotti's lonely characterization. This seems to be a major characterization of him so far. We want to be paying attention to that as we go along in the story. And to add to this, John and Lorraine are concerned about the situation. They even leave for a moment while Mr. Pignotti is playing with Bobo and throwing food at him. There's something that should be concerning. Just like when they first got there and were worried that he might be a serial killer, same thing applies to this scene. Now, this final scene of the chapter is bizarre. I'm not just talking about the baboon part. I'm talking about the part that should be a funny image to you. If you paid attention, John starts making noises at the baboons and at the primates in the zoo, and we should be thinking about how that would look to have a teenager, in this case, a freshman/sophomore, making this scene at the zoo. And to add to this, Mr. Pignotti joins in. He's the adult, though, so this should be odd to us. As a final scene in the story, we should expect a certain reaction from an adult character. We've already had Mr. Pignotti characterized as being a bit childish, and that continues here in this scene. But in the open, in the public, we should be curious about why Mr. Pignotti would act that way. Now let's make some advanced inferences here. First of all, at this point, each character is spoken 3 times. But I wonder if you noticed the chapters often happen in pairs, because if we want to show something about John's life or John's characterization, we want to have an equal amount for Lorraine. So Paulsendale has to find ways to do that throughout the story. So in this case, I need to make sure that I'm looking at similar focal points. What is the focus of chapters 5 and 6? And as I showed you in my title, it's all about the families and Mr. Pignotti. We're seeing a lot about them and how the characters interact with this situation. Likewise, I start wondering, we're in the rising action, what happened to all the conflict? Because John, Lorraine, and Mr. Pignotti seem to be getting along. So when I'm looking at this, the major conflicts are in the background and they're far away, or they are away from that relationship. Those family situations we're seeing, that's the type of conflict, whether you want to call it characters or society. The conflict here that I keep pointing out, Mr. Pignotti seems to be a bit strange for an adult. That has to make me wonder what's going on. It's not a scary conflict per se, but it is something that makes me think about who is Mr. Pignotti and what's going on here with this character. And all types of other conflicts exist in the story. Lorraine has conflicts and internal problems. John has problems as well. There are always going to be conflicts to be looking at, and we're just trying to figure out right now what is going to be the major conflict of the story. I think it's part of the reason I like this story so much that we're into chapter 6. We're a third of the way in, actually more than a third of the way in, and I'm still not fully sure what the big conflict is going to be. It makes me want to keep reading and see what's going to happen. Now, with the readers making connections, you should always be making connections in the story. I want to compare those unusual events to my experiences. If I've been at the zoo with an adult, I know how they normally react. If I've had to knock on a stranger's door for a fundraiser or something like that, I know the typical reaction. I want to be looking at how Mr. Pignotti is different from that normal teenager to adult interaction. I also want to make connections in certain places. For instance, maybe I've had a family situation similar to John Lorraine. Maybe I've been a teenager and I'm looking at adults, or I'm an adult looking at a teenager, and I can talk about how they interact. And I can also talk about the experiences at school, zoo, at home, etc. I want to always be trying to make connections between myself and the story, even just between other stories, to figure out what could happen next. And most importantly, especially at this point in the story, we're still trying to figure out the conflict, still trying to figure out what's going on with these characters and what could happen next. We should constantly be making predictions. So much has happened in these first 6 chapters, and as you're reading, keep thinking about what could happen next. Use those reading strategies to figure out what could happen based on your prior knowledge, what you know about novels, and basically what your purpose is in reading here, which is identifying how young adult novels have kind of been created and how stories work in the long haul. And that's it for today's slideshow. If you have any questions, once again, always contact me, and thanks for watching.